Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Passage Podcast. My name is Aaron Lorch, and I'm today's host. This podcast aims to pursue the truth, an authentic Catholic life, a deep integration of faith and reason, and a joyful community of families, raising the next generation of the Catholic faithful. Today's guest is Andrew Gniadek, who is the IT and technology specialist for the Lakes Catholic community for the Okoboji, Iowa area parishes of St. Mary and St. Joseph. Andrew is also the creator of Luminous Tradition, a company focusing on engaging philosophy and scripture through the Carmelite tradition. He publishes regular blog posts on this topic and also is an active podcaster himself with Midnight Carmelite, a podcast where Andrew dives into the doctrine of St. John of the Cross and Carmelite tradition, aiming to challenge listeners both intellectually and spiritually. I'm really excited to share our admittedly long but fascinating conversation through this episode, where Andrew and I discuss facets of faith, history, philosophy, applications for both intellect and spirituality, and of course, so much more. We hope you enjoy our conversation and that it might bless you in some way. All right, here we go. Andrew Gniadek. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Fantastic. We're here today at St. Mary Parish. We're both a part of this Lakes Catholic community. Can you kind of explain to the listener a little bit what you do here and how I know you that way? Sure.
So what I do for the Lakes Catholic community is I do their IT work. So I manage their emails, help with tech issues. It's basically a tech ER where it's like, what's going on? And I come in and I fix it. So that's a kind of broad stroke, but it's everything and anything dealing with IT. So
And how did you get roped up into doing that?
So what happened is my wife got hired here, I think about 3 years ago now.
That sounds right.
Yeah, about 3 years. And they were having tech issues at that time, and they said, we need someone to do that. And she's like, well, my husband can come help. So I went and I fixed some things, and they said, you need to keep fixing things. And 3 years later, here I am.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And you might be stuck a while.
I think so.
There's a limited amount of people that understand that field.
Yeah, and also I feel like in my background, I did some computer science work in a formal program, and I ended up leaving because, in my opinion, there's a divorce between information technology and computer science. And a lot of the people coming out of those programs are application programmers. So they'd be like building a program that we're recording this podcast on, or building Microsoft Word, or building some website. Whereas information technology is more about the infrastructure for those applications. So.
Yeah. And now my understanding would be there's actually less people in the latter field probably. There's probably way more programmers and software engineers nowadays than the latter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with my upbringing too. So I was brought up with computers. My father's a physician. I came from Connecticut actually, and so he bought one of the first personal computers back in the early 80s and used it in his office, but we also had one at home. And at that time, for those who remember, is you had to really understand the hardware and the software and how they interface. And then as computers became more and more sophisticated, more powerful, and people started using it more in a consumer way, knowing that integration became less important. It was more about what you can do with it.
Correct.
So.
Yeah. Earlier, you had to understand every little bit about it, and now we have iOS.
Exactly, right, exactly. So a lot of what my focus on would be like systems. So like it'd be understanding how Android works, iOS works, Windows works, Mac OS works, the hardware that's powering that. One of my favorite classes when I do computer science work was assembly, because I felt like it was like I'm telling the hardware directly in a one-to-one way how to move things around in memory and things like that. So that's the end of IT I'm at. So
Sure. Yeah, and what you've told me before, and just for the listener, you have what you're doing for the church, but you also have kind of your quote-unquote other day job, and that's also in that tech field as well, right?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'll do is I'll have individuals and small businesses either in the area here or remotely, and I'll support them in their tech needs. So like, as an example, the website gaudium@spes22.com with Dr. Larry Chapp, I'm his tech guy. So I run the whole thing on the tech side, and we work together closely. So
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him. We'll talk about more. I'm sure we'll talk about him a lot this episode.
Cool.
But the other thing that the listeners probably don't know about you is that you have your own podcast and have for years now. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So that podcast, Midnight Carmelite, it's a part of my company, Luminous Tradition. And Midnight Carmelite came out of the fact that for me, I live and follow Carmelite spirituality. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to bring some of what I do in the scholarly sphere, because I'm also a scholar. I wanted to bring that to people so they can apply it in their lives. And so, because I feel like there's sometimes a disconnect where people will say, well, I want to be more prayerful, I want to grow in my spiritual life, well, what do I do? Yeah. And my hope was to bring that aspect of the faith to them with the podcast.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, really, too. And what kind of topics, if someone hasn't ever listened to you on a podcast app before, what kind of topics might you range into? And you want to talk a little bit about the history, like with St. John of the Cross, et cetera?
Absolutely. So for me, what kind of, to back up to the history, like you're saying, is I encountered St. John of the Cross over 8 years ago, and I knew of him, but I didn't really read his writings, and it was through Pope St. John Paul II's dissertation on faith according to St. John of the Cross. And once I started going through that dissertation, because I'm a philosopher, it answered questions I had about the limits of things. And so, because my specialization, one of them in philosophy, is metaphysics, so I'm always dealing with limits. And when I saw that there's this encounter between God and man through prayer, and John showed me that through faith in that dissertation, I read everything John wrote, and I was so struck by it, and it set me so much on fire that I'm like, I need to share this. And so my podcast, to answer your question, is to take all my scholarship in philosophy and scripture and then bring St. John of the Cross in and the other Carmelite saints in that intersection and integration of them and how it applies to your daily life. And so it's just a lot of, kind of condensed, usually 5 to 7 minutes, could be as long as 12 minutes, kind of depends of, hey, this is something to pay attention to. So for example, how does purity of heart relate to presence? Like the presence of God. And, the more you work on your purity of heart and what that means, that's going to allow you to see God's presence within you and within others and in the world. So,
yeah. And actually, again, we have a wide variety of listeners out there. Can we actually back up even more with the history? Can you actually explain what a Carmelite is? Talk about the history with, the Reformed order. Mm-hmm. So St. Teresa and
St. John.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. So the Carmelites were founded during the Crusades in the Holy Land. The earliest, we have some historical accounts of pilgrims who said there are these, monks on Mount Carmel and they have this chapel to Mary or whatever.
Yeah.
But the main document would be what's called the Rule of St. Albert. And you can go buy this or go look it up online, and it lays out the formula of life for the Carmelites. And what happened is once the Arabs started retaking the Holy Land and kicking out the Crusaders, the Carmelites went from the Holy Land where they were founded into Western Europe, and they kind of didn't fit in because their spirituality and practices were more what we would call Eastern today than Western. Yeah. They were then folded into the mendicant way of life with the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And what ends up happening over time is they go to the cities, because there's this urbanization at the time over the subsequent centuries. And the reform with Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, what that was is you had the Black Death, and you had what's called the relaxing of the rule, where like certain practices in the order weren't as strict as they were. And then before Teresa and John came about, in different pockets of Carmels, there was this resurgence of, hey, we need to get back to who we really are. We need to start really, focusing in on the conversation with God, His presence and prayer. And what ends up happening is Teresa actually lived what's called the mitigated rule, I think until she was 39, and then felt called to found the Discalced Carmelites, which were following the ancient rule that came from the Holy Land. And John was recruited by her when she was 52 and he was 25, and she needed to found the friars, and John was brought in, and then the rest is history. So,
but it wasn't quite that easy, though. I mean, from what I've read before, there was a lot of pushback at first when he was.
Oh, as far as in the founding of the Discalced. Oh, absolutely, there was pushback. So you had them start. They started with the blessing of the order to found these houses that followed the ancient rule. But what happened is a lot of the histories will tell you there's like a miscommunication between the mitigated rule, or what are the Carmelites of Age and Observance today, and then Discalced Carmelites. There were jealousies, there was politics, there's just all the human things we see today. So all those things blended created this tension where at one point John was actually kidnapped and brought to Toledo, I believe, where they basically locked him in a closet for 9 months and flogged him every Friday for the fact that they were considering him a rebel against their order.
Yeah, so it's like their own dudes too.
Yeah, exactly. But according to the accounts, he bore it extremely well, and I've always that particular part of him really always stuck out to me and meant a lot to me, because I could never do that. I mean, I hope I would, but I mean, it was basically the old bathroom they locked him in for 9 months. And I mean,
crazy.
The heroic sanctity you need to go through that, I think, is unreal.
Well, there was a lot of grace there, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yep. That's where he wrote a lot of his poems.
Yep.
So,
well, you think about St. Paul from Scripture, a lot of some of his best writing, it came through those trials and tribulations, when he was, again, being flogged or being jailed, really the same thing.
Right, exactly. And with John, after he got out, it changed him so much. You can see it in his writings. You can see that moment, that his dark night in those 9 months, I would argue from everything I've studied him is the pivotal moment. That's the turning point for him, and you see it mature over time to the end of his life on how he encounters others, how he encounters God, and what he wants to bring to the church and for the good of the church. So
that time was definitely used for good in the end.
100%. And I think it's a lesson I've always tried to internalize is no matter what, God's in control. God's providence is in control. John of the Cross, this very holy man, was locked in a closet for 9 months and flogged and wrongfully accused. I mean, like Christ, right? But in that darkness, he encountered God. And I think even if you look at the, kind of a side tangent, if you look at the Greek fathers and they talk about this, the Gregorianess of the divine darkness and this pseudo-Dionysius, this constant thing where people, we forget that God's beyond limits. Yeah. He's beyond being. So our encounter with him, the mode is going to be dark to our intellect because we can't comprehend him, but we can experience him. And I think John experienced his presence there, and that's what changed him so much.
Yeah, and when did the mysticism kind of come about?
For me?
Yeah.
So for me, what happened was, I studied philosophy, and that's my area of expertise. And what I realized, though, was that philosophy, if you look at the history of it, a lot of the times it'll kind of be done right for a small period of time, and then it kind of lags and either gets integrated into something else or frankly goes in the wrong direction. So as an example, for your listeners who may not be familiar, there's a Frenchman, René Descartes, and he said, the famous, normally translated, I think, therefore I am. Yep. But the idea being is that like the subject is the only thing that exists. In other words, his thoughts are the only things he can't doubt. The rest of the world he's skeptical about, right? Yeah. And so someone would argue, for example, from a Cartesian position, well, if I take a stick and I put it in water, it bends, so my eyes are deceiving me. That's what he mean by subject. In other words, they're saying my eyes have failed me. I have to use my thinking to deal with this deception in reality. But a proper understanding of philosophy would say, no, your eyes are doing their job. They're dealing with the light being bent by the water, showing you that it's bent. It's your reason that's supposed to say, hey, the stick is straight. It's just light bending it. So it's not your eye's fault, like a Cartesian would say. A sense realist, Thomas, Aristotle, that whole vein of philosophy would say, no, what's really happening is your eyes are just simply taking in and sensing and bringing that to your imagination and intellect to constitute what's actually going on. So,
yeah. And so where did you go from there?
Well, once I realized this, I felt like there were limits on the discussion of God. So for me, you would talk about God and people would say, oh, he's, like I said earlier, he's beyond being, he's all good, all perfect.
And so you don't normally hear that. Most people don't look at it that way.
What do you mean?
Well, what you've been just saying, you discovered that, or you looked at that. Mm-hmm. But if you just talk to some random parishioner, are they going to say that?
That God's all perfect, all good, and all these other things?
That he's beyond reason.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't.
He's beyond
I can't speak for them. Probably not.
Probably
I don't
not.
know.
I mean, I'm just thinking of all my encounters at like a youth group bonfire type thing.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Your average, I guess we're sitting across from each other on couches, but usually that type of a conversation, like a Bible study, you can get into some deep conversations, but there's always a sort of a limit, again, because of our comprehension.
Right.
But once you can acknowledge that, you can go to the next step, I think.
Yeah, and that's a good way of saying, that's like part of what happened to me. So like I acknowledged that, but like I didn't know where to go. So then what happened was I'm like, well, what do I do? Like I know there's something beyond this. That's only the part of the answer.
So how long were you in this limbo then?
Oh, that was years. So I'd say about 3 years, 4 years. And it wasn't until the dissertation by Pope St. John Paul II. Because what happened was, it's a funny story. I remember it was in December 2018-ish. I think that's around when. Anyway, yeah, this is when I read it. And because I remember distinctly, it was snowing outside and we were sitting, my wife Cynthia and I, we were sitting down and she was doing work. And I was like, well, what am I going to do? And for some reason, she's like, hey, I think you should read this, and kind of tosses this book at me. I'm like, okay. And it's actually one of the moments I had free time. And I said, Faith According to St. John of the Cross. I'm like, I've heard of St. John of the Cross. And I started reading it, and it gave me that other part. Uh-huh. And then I said, now that's where the mysticism came in. And I felt deeply convicted that I was called to that life in my own way in a lay state. And also for answering my intellectual questions. So then I just kept following that path.
And how fast after that did you decide, okay, I need to share this? Like you said at the beginning of the podcast here, that I need to do something. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then, I'll do a podcast.
Right.
Where did that come in? Or where am I going to start this organization?
Sure. So, well, for a while I was just praying with it. So for me, what I do, and this is just my personal thing, is when I have something like that happen, I want to take time and
discern it.
Yeah, discern it. Let God kind of work with me and cooperate with whatever he wants with it as best as, I can. Of
course.
And
you don't always get a neon sign with an arrow saying this way.
It's exactly right. And I think that I guess, I read this, actually, I think this is from St. John of the Cross, is where he talks about God's like a master painter and we're painting the canvas. And sometimes he'll come over and say, paint this, paint that, paint this. Other times he'll take your hand and guide it. And other times he'll step back and he'll let you kind of add your own touches to the painting. Because it's all about love and cooperation.
I think of like when we were kids and it was like a little letter in each section of the paint. So it's like paint by numbers. Which one. So you're kind of guided. Then sometimes we're not putting the right color in.
Right. Yeah. So I think, exactly. So I think to answer your question, it was about, I think like almost 2 years. It's almost 2 years. So it's like late 2019, early 2020. So
right before COVID kind of time frame?
Yeah, it was right before COVID. And it was so late 20, so that'd be about a year or change. And so, I said, and I need to share this, and I want to, because people were coming to me with questions, and just atheist friends, agnostic friends, Catholic friends. And they came to me like, well, what do you think of this? What do you think? And I'm like, well,
is that because they already knew you were like a scholar, or because you'd already expressed that, hey, I've been doing all this reading?
They know I'm a scholar. So then I'll talk to them about what I'm reading as I'm, kind of processing it, like I was saying. Okay. And so then they they came to me and I said, I feel like I'm feeling that the world needs prayer. Like, I think that, we have facts are not intelligence. It's our love of God that makes us great. I remember reading St. Faustina's diary, the Divine Mercy diary, and reading the whole thing through. And when you look at those bold sections, I spend time reading these brilliant, scholars all the time. Like, and you read that and you see her simple writing, and all of a sudden you see that bold. That's not her. It can't be her. And I think you see how much truth she puts forward when she had no education. That
it's just raw.
Exactly. And I think that shows that how crucial prayer is and the mystical life is. And the mystical life's for everybody. It's all that prayer life with God. Like,
there has to be openness first, though. You said it's for everybody, but there has to be an openness to receive his gifts and to be led as well.
For sure. Yeah.
So the average person's going to say, no, that's not for me. It's really cool that, Andrew's going this route, but it's not for me.
Right.
It's that block.
Yeah. Cause I think they conflate. So if you're speaking about like fellow Catholics there, then I think that there's not enough discussion of a growth, in my opinion, of a growth in the mystical life. And again, they don't have to be Carmelites. Like they don't have to focus on the continual presence of God and prayer and the growth of that interior life, and then bringing the love of God to others from that. Which doesn't say that like the Dominicans don't pray. They do, but they're the order of preachers. It doesn't mean the Franciscans don't pray. They're, bringing poverty. That's their evangelical call, and their poverty brings Christ. So in other words, it's kind of like a cube. There's all these different sides, but it's one Catholic Church, one mystical life. But you can pick certain emphases based on what God's calling you to, and in living those emphases, you're bringing the diversity and splendor of the church, which is Jesus Christ, to others. So,
yeah, and there's a million ways you can turn that Rubik's Cube, and it's all going to come back together.
Exactly.
End,
Yep.
And I think one thing that you were kind of touching on there, but I'd like to elaborate more on too, is as a listener listens to us rambling and going into the books and the heady stuff.
Yep.
I don't want people to feel overwhelmed and like, oh man, this is over the top, or this isn't for me, right? Or I don't want to be a Carmelite, right?
Right.
I really liked it when you said there, not everybody has to be called to a certain life, but we're all called to be holy. We're all called to be striving for sainthood.
Right.
We're all called to that greater relationship with Christ.
Yep.
And that's a lot of what you're doing with your podcast too. You're not telling everybody, hey, at the beginning of this episode, I'm going to tell you, just like I told you the last one, we all need to be Carmelites.
Exactly.
Mister. No, you're not doing that.
Right.
You're trying to invite everyone to draw into themselves and have that greater reflection, greater time to then grow and have action from it too.
Yeah, so I'll say two things to what you said. So in the Rule of St. Albert, paragraph 2, it says, many and varied are the ways to serve Jesus Christ. So even in the Carmelite rule itself, it's saying this rule is for Carmelites, but there are many and varied ways to serve Christ. So in other words, not everyone needs to be Carmelite to grow in the mystical life. And to your second point about the podcast saying, it doesn't say that you want to be Carmelite. It's imagine the Catholic Church is like a buffet, and there's all the saints, there's all the doctrine and teachings and everything. And I'm simply saying, hey, try this plate, because this particular plate, it may add something to the dish that you're making to go eat, and the dish being your life, your vocation, which you have all your own unique things that you've picked from the buffet that God's called you to. I'm simply contributing understanding and clarity from the Carmelite perspective to the one mystery of Christ's mystical body, his church.
It's probably two different metaphors you'd probably a million, but I look at that as the buffet, it nourishes you, and you could indulge in that and pull a lot from it, and you can pick and choose.
Yes.
But also the thing in my mind is like, it's almost like going into a shop and opening up your big tool chest, and this is one of the tools.
For sure. That's a good metaphor too.
To fix issues or to grow and to build, right? And it's just one of the tools out there of many.
Yeah, and I think the crucial distinction is that if you're looking at it that way as the tool, that's an abstraction. In other words, what you're saying is that it may or may not be for them. And I think each person needs to decide what God's calling them to. So whatever tool they pick out of that, that's the one God wants them to use for their particular problem.
Exactly.
So you don't use, a hammer to, shave wood off a chair. You're like, so you have to match the tool to your vocational task.
Exactly.
So.
Yep. And each tool could be different for each person.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be like, you can have a little knife, for example, of a tool, a little knife, and then someone has a giant, machete. I don't know. You know what I mean? Saying it just because they're both of the genus knives doesn't mean that you have to have the identical one. And that's another thing I've noticed in the church. There's sometimes a misunderstanding between unity and uniformity. Unity.
Can I go more on that?
Yeah, sure. So unity, an easy way to explain it would be if you look at I think it's 24 autocephalous rites in the Catholic Church. So there's, the Byzantine, the Maronite, the Latin rite, this, I think Sino-Malabar. I don't know them all off the top of my head. The point
is that last one? I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, I think it's Sino-Malabar anyway.
Sino-Malabar?
Sino-Malabar, I think it's called, yeah.
And where
I don't remember. I just know the name because I saw it on the list. It is a cool name. Yeah. So anyway, so they, the Maronites are the ones I'm dealing with now. But anyway, they have I'll use the Maronites as an example then. They have their own liturgy. They have a lot of their own theology. And that doesn't mean it's conflicting. It means it's complementary. So back to your point about me, am I imposing Carmelite spirituality or am I saying Carmelite spirit? No, it's simply a complement to someone's vocation life. So everything I talk about in the podcast is meant to complement their growth in the interior life and prayer, because that's what the Carmelites focused on. And that's what I think in my life, in my vocation, that little slice is my way of bringing God's love to someone, to give them that clarity on that so that hopefully they can grow in love of God and presence of God and bring that to others.
Okay. So back to your podcast, like Midnight Carmelite.
Sure.
For anybody that has never listened to it and they're interested, like, I might put this on my roster.
Mm-hmm.
What would be an example of a topic you might discuss? And you can explain this. I know back a while you were doing them quite more often and you've kind of went a less frequency now.
Sure.
But how often are you doing a podcast release? And, are they 3 hours long? Or are they 7 minutes? You want to talk about that?
Sure. So in the beginning, I would go from as far as length, from 12 to 15 minutes, and it would center on one point. So for example, I did a series of podcasts on St. John of the Cross's understanding of detachment. So how do you identify detachment in your life? What is detachment? Does detachment mean I to get rid of everything in my life and have nothing? So addressing objections, dealing with what something is, how do you apply it? That's generally the formula.
Yep.
And so I try and keep it short because not only are you dealing with a very abstract, immaterial subject, prayer, spiritual life, some philosophy, and I want to kind of just have one little nugget that they can take away and kind of ponder, chew on. The fathers, when they talk about scripture, they talk about chewing on it like cud, this kind of munching. And that's what I'm aiming at. I'm trying to give you something to munch on. Just think about it.
It's not just munching though. And as a farmer, I'll tell you that chewing your cud,
yep,
like a cow would, they're actually, well, it's kind of gross, but they're regurgitating it and then they're chewing it. And then
there you go.
But what that is you're not chewing, it's not even really like chewing gum, because that's just staying here.
Okay.
And you're not consuming it.
Yep.
You're not actually pulling anything from it.
Yep.
It's almost like if you ever heard the phrase chew the fat?
No.
Oh, okay. It just means basically kind of like just to chit chat and just kind of just BS, or just kind of casually talking and just kind of sitting around, like sitting out on the front porch and just chewing the fat.
Okay.
Well, and that actually comes from back in the day, it's probably the South, or just, farmers, farm folk, country folk, mm-hmm, where they'd butcher a pig, and then they would use everything, and the real thick fat, they would take pieces of that, and that's what they did before gum, and they would just chew on that and chew.
Interesting.
It's so thick, and it would just kind of, it has good flavor in it,
Okay.
So that's not really, we can't do what cows do with regurgitation and then truly chewing the cud. But when they use that phrase, did they actually use that exact phrase?
That, yeah.
Okay, because I get what they're getting at there. It's not just chewing gum, and it's not just chewing food and swallowing it and then goes through our system and then it's one and done.
Yep.
Right? They are pulling it in, and then you have to pull it back out to really attest to it again.
Yep.
And again and again. Because really, think about the best book you've read, or you have a whole stack of them, right? You go back to them. You pull it off the bookshelf. That's why you own it, right? It's not so you're just going to read it once and be done.
Right.
Consume that delicious pie and then it's done.
Right.
You're going to chew the cud a little bit.
Right. Yeah. No, I didn't know about the regurgitation thing. I always thought it was just chewing. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, that makes a lot more sense now. Thanks. That's great. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that you internalize it and then take time with it. And again, it's not going to be a scholarly treatise. I've never wanted I will address certain things like original language. So I'll sometimes translate scripture from the Greek, and I'll explain what they may see in different translations, things that may be confusing, and try and give more clarity there. So for, exegesis, I'll do that. But other than that, and then citing writings very rarely, but it's usually things that you hear and you understand. So like one of my favorites is at the beginning of Story of a Soul by Therese of Lisieux. She talks about the garden, and she talks about
beautiful.
And she says, Jesus showed me that if he wants you to be a violet or a daisy, be a violet or a daisy. You don't have to be a rose to be holy. And I think in today's society, we kind of forget that. God calls us to be who he wants us to be, not what we want us to be.
We all think we have to be roses.
Right. Well, and not only that,
culture tells us that too.
Yeah. And even when I started, to your point earlier about what made me decide to go the Carmelite route from philosophy, I did receive pushback from people I knew in philosophy for doing this, because they saw it as kind of woo-woo and like, so
you're doing the Eastern stuff,
you're going, this isn't reasonable. They never said that, but it was kind of implied in the criticisms. And so,
was that just when you started diving in with, or when you wanted to do the podcast? Or was it before
when
that?
I was diving in, it was just private, but it was when I started doing the podcast.
Okay.
When I started the business, I received a decent amount of pushback on it. So.
Okay.
Yep.
And besides the podcast, this is a good moment you haven't mentioned yet on the podcast here. You also have like a forum and a site where you have kind of it's not Patreon, right? But you have a group of people that can come together and discuss, that there's value to that.
Yeah, so
those aren't the pushback people.
Yeah, those aren't the pushback people. So I have a small community of people where I set up, using all my tech skills, I set up a small private Facebook. So you make posts, you can post videos, you can do these things. So it's private though, and so you pay to enter. It's like $30 a month, and you can just talk with people, chat with them, chat with me, and kind of hash these things out in a space where it's not public, where you are able to ask the questions you may not want to ask, or you may feel embarrassed or whatever. And you should never feel embarrassed. We're all trying, we're all figuring things out. Like no one knows everything except God. But anyway, so it's that, and then I'll post things there that, kind of deeper dives, something like with the podcast, like I said, I try and keep it, one little nugget. That one in the community, I may have a longer forum post where you have comments on it like Facebook, and people say, well, what do you mean by this? And we'll kind of go back and forth and hash it out. So.
Okay. Now, and speaking of your podcast, as you've gone through this time frame, and it's normally just you chatting.
Yep.
But a few times I've listened to some pretty good interviews you've had, like Dr. Chap you've had on multiple times.
Yep. You
want to kind of tell the listener, maybe they don't even know who he is. You want to talk about him a little bit and why you're so integrated with him, and maybe why you've had these discussions. You already mentioned that you run his website. But.
So Larry, he does a lot of work on communio theology. And what communio theology is it was a academic journal started after the Second Vatican Council in response to another academic journal called, I think, Concilium, that they were taking the Second Vatican Council in a direction that was contrary to the reading of the council, according to these people who founded it. There's still a significant scholarly debate about that today. So I don't want to make it sound like it's settled science. Anyway, so Balthasar, I think it's Balthasar, Ratzinger, de Lubac, I think these guys all founded Communio. And Communio kind of became the place where you would dive into the theology of Vatican II as well as the greater tradition and apply it to the modern world. Like how is this applicable today? What should we be looking for? Larry did his dissertation on Balthazar, and so he's a Balthazarian through and through. And he ended up in 2020 starting a website called GaudiumSpis22.com, and he does podcast interviews with a lot of scholars. So because he was a professor for 20 years and retired, and then became a Catholic worker farmer in Pennsylvania. So he's really into Dorothy Day and all that. And so anyway, how I met him was when his blog first came out, I came across it and I was like, this is awesome. Like, this guy's brilliant. And so he asked for tech help, or said he needed tech help. And I reached out, and we kind of got in touch then. And then I, offered him my services, and here we are, and we've become great friends. So, and that was, we're coming up on 4 years I've been working with him. So I'll have him, to answer your question, I'll have him on the podcast. Usually what we'll do is we'll jump between one or the other. And for me, what I like to have him on for is because I'm focused on spirituality and philosophy. He brings the communio theology, so you kind of get all three. So when you listen to, Larry and Andrew talk, you're going to get Lublin Thomism, all the things I was trained in, and then you're going to get communio, Balthazar, and we're going to be talking to each other. And he loves it, I love it, because the amount of overlap is great. And I think it also shows that even though there's all these different areas in the Catholic Church, different places to go, it's all one. It's all one in Christ. And you can see that in those interviews. So
yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that your podcast isn't mostly interview based.
No.
It's mostly because you're pulling off of your own thoughts, and it's almost, I can just imagine you're just sitting in even though you're not doing this in your car, but in my mind, I'd like to imagine you're just driving down the road by yourself, and you're just like talking out your thoughts, talking to yourself, and it happens to be recorded. I know that's not what it is, but it comes off that way.
That's kind of what it is in a lot of ways. Like I'll sit down and I'll maybe write something out, but Bishop Sheen is near and dear to my heart. And he said once that he kind of did podcasts before there were podcasts.
Yeah, that's right.
And so at the beginning of that series,
Trailblazer,
Life is Worth Living, Part 1, it has that golden castle looking thing on Audible anyway. He said, I could write this all down. He goes, but what I think it's better that I read, I think, and then I speak from the heart. So I took that to heart, pun intended, and that's how I generally do it, is I just speak from, so even if I'm wrong, I say, you know what, I'm speaking from the heart, and that's what happens. So.
Well, and that is what podcasts are today, typically.
Right.
The most authentic ones are the most popular for a reason. They're raw, they're authentic. They have their ums and knows and all that good stuff.
Yep.
But it's from the heart.
Exactly.
And of course, there's a wide variety of the topics out there, from political to farming to how to cook something or whatever have you.
Right.
But when it comes to spirituality, a spiritual podcast where it's from your heart and mind, you want to have it so that you're not this well-rehearsed thing, or
it's inauthentic. I think
it is.
Yeah.
And you're going to miss something. Back to the chewing the cud analogy.
Yep.
You've took it in, and then you've spit out what you wrote down, and you're going to read. But if you would have pulled it back up and chewed on it a bit, you're missing something probably. Yeah,
and I also think that when you speak from the heart versus writing it down and just reading it, you're almost working through it again in live time, which adds to the authenticity.
That's what I meant by
you're
chewing the cud.
Yeah, chewing the cud.
That's what we're doing right now.
That's what we're doing right now. Yeah,
we're literally just pulling it out.
And I think that also too, I feel like when you're dealing with the mystical life, it's not something like you can write down about it, but it's experiential. It's not an abstraction. In other words, I'm not like in philosophy, for example, you could talk about nature, right? So I could say, well, what do you mean by nature? Well, I could say the operation of the thing. That's the definition, right? But in the mystical life, it's a personal relationship. So, I can never define my marriage to Cynthia. I could only know it through love. And since that's what the mystical life is, it's not intellectual knowledge. Love is the principle of the intellectual life, not reason. And I think that trips people up. And that's what I'm trying to get across, is I'm trying to say, this is coming from the fact that I love Jesus Christ, and I believe he's calling me to this. So therefore, this is the knowledge I've gained from that love, And hopefully that clarity can bring you your greater love so he can give you the knowledge to live that Christ life.
They can experience it.
Exactly.
Well. Again, experiential nature.
Yep.
Kind of on that note.
Okay.
So experiencing it, and also something that you touched back earlier here when you were talking about with your podcast episodes, whether it's 5 minutes just off the cuff or it's a little longer, 30 minutes, whatever have you, you kind of touched in. Can you name the three or four tangents you wanted to go? You list something, you mull over it, and then the end thing is you give them a nugget of wisdom to make that's actionable. What am I missing there? Is that
no? I think it's good. Yeah.
Okay. So with that third one, where they're going to take it, and you and I were talking about this on the phone the other day.
Yeah.
You confessed to me that one thing you've been mulling over is, am I reaching people? Am I or aren't I? I don't know if I am. I don't know if they're pulling it in and chewing on it, or are they actually taking action with it? That's a question. Are you since our last conversation about that? Are you still thinking in that way? Let's talk about that a little bit, because that's really how it ties with Catholic passages missing too. Sure.
So I have thought about it. Kind of like my rough initial thoughts. Like, in no way this is like the final, I'm not making a scholarly conclusion here. We're podcasting. So I think that there's a couple things that came to mind. First is I still don't know the answer to that question directly. In other words, I don't know. I'm still struggling with trying to figure out how to convey that so that I feel like I'm doing my part, because I can't control other people, nor do I want to. But I also think that I don't want to do something that I think God wants me to do, and then I'm doing. In other words, Saint Ignatius talks about this. He talks about how a person who's trying to follow God, and I'm kind of summarizing, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, is that Satan won't present an evil to people who are super practicing Catholic, let's say. He's not going to do that because he knows you're going to avoid sin. He knows you're going to confession, and he knows you're taking the Eucharist. What he's going to do is he's going to say, look, here's this good. Mm-hmm. Isn't this great? And it's a good in se, meaning in itself, it podcasting, right?
That's how they catch you off guard.
Great. But that good in itself is not the good God wants me to pursue. He wants me to pursue this right now. And we have to remember that we don't operate in abstraction. And what I mean by that is you have two goods. It's not simply like saying, well, podcasting is good. I've been doing it. I should keep doing it. The question is what does God want me to do right now?
Yeah.
Because I could be dead tomorrow.
They'll usually throw in doubts in there too.
Right.
I've had this with spiritual warfare before too.
Right.
Actually, when I was first kind of starting off with Catholic passage stuff with Father Feller and getting so involved with it, it was consumed a lot of time. It still is a lot of time. But there was the evil one was throwing in the doubts, and there'd be introduced. Here's one good thing,
right?
And here's this other great thing that I need to do, and they're both important.
That's it.
But it's okay, now it's not as easy. It's not black and white,
sure,
or at least it doesn't come off that way on first glance.
Sure,
if you're not being introspective enough, you're not praying about it enough, because it's they're both good,
right? Should
I be doing them both,
right?
Which one should I do? And then you become anxious from that, and you do have to discern that. So
I think discernment, that word there, is the key to answer your question about what I think to do. So again, this is not a full scholarly, deep dive, but I feel like one of the problems we have in our modern culture today, to answer the part about Catholic passage, is we are pre-philosophical and theological. In other words, we have gone so far away from, St. Clement of Alexandria talks about how philosophy was kind of the preparation for the Hellenic mind, whereas for the law was for the Hebrews. And there's a lot of scholarship that talks about, they look at the Ten Commandments and say, well, honor your father and mother. That you could come up with that or something, but you can't come up with the New Testament or something. There's some scholars who argue that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is that I
don't buy that.
I don't buy that. But the point is that there's preparation for receiving Christ. The soil's got, Christ talks about the seeds in the soil, the rocky soil, the thorns, and the good soil. So what I think's happened is we're pre that step. So we're pre the gospel. So in other words, it's that the soil is is not even prepared to receive the preparation. So we need like a propedeutic, like an introductory course. Propedeutic. It's a fancy word for introductory. So we need an introductory course to like philosophy and theology in the mental space, at least not in the heart, but like in the mental space, to be able to receive and grow in the gospel in that mode. Because if you don't have that, then to your earlier point, you said people say, well, why do I care? Because in other words, if people don't believe that there's something that's beyond them that has and I use authority here in the sense of like causal responsibility. In other words, if they think that they're responsible for the fact that they exist, that's completely absurd.
Exactly.
If they think that all their success is dependent on themselves, even a natural explanation says, well, you had friends, you had your neighbors, your family, like at some level you had assistance. We're not in like bubbles. And so,
there are people that believe that way, but they end up failing.
True. That's exactly right. And I think
people do better when we believe that there's a higher power in some version of assistance or control,
Right, exactly. And I think that
throughout time,
right. So I think that to kind of your point about the two goods, I think that Ignatius, I would argue, is crucial for our time. And there's a great author, he's a brilliant guy, he's a brilliant scholar, but he writes books for people who aren't scholars on Ignatius, Father Timothy Gallagher. I have found those books to be incredibly helpful for this discerning problem. Like he has, discernment of spirits in marriage, discernment of spirit. I'm probably getting the titles wrong, but you can go on Amazon and find it.
He has some stuff on Audible too. I don't remember if it's him narrating or not. And then for the listener, if you have already encountered Hallow, the Hallow app, they have some stuff with him on there as well. That is a great introduction on a very base level for just what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think Ignatian spirituality is going to have its day. Because if you look at St. Teresa and even John was educated by Jesuits. His classical education before Salamanca was all Jesuits. In fact, it was a Jesuit school, I think, for orphans that he was working at. He was so poor, and his father was dead, and that St. John of the Cross was working at a hospital, and they believe it was a hospital for people with syphilis. So he's dealing with some of the hardest thing to deal with at that time, and the hospital owner basically sent him to this Jesuit school. And then that's when he went on to Salamanca and then obviously onto the Carmelites. And then Teresa of Avila, one of her formators or spiritual directors was Jesuit. So she always spoke very highly of the Jesuits. Yeah. So I think Ignatian spiritualities had their day with them in helping them form the Discalced Carmelites and live their spirituality. But I think
it's going to have its day to day.
It's going to have its day to day because you can't. If you can't discern and judge between goods, in other words, we have an attenuated, weakened ability to do that, then we're going to fall into these traps of Satan where we're going to think this is what we should be doing, and God actually wants us to do the opposite.
I like the way in real time I can see the wheels turn, and you're like, okay, now I got to say a word that's actually attenuated. Sorry, weakened.
Yeah, that's why propedeutic. I was like introductory. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so back to really this main point, this action. Yep. The question, and I know we're not writing an expose or a dissertation on this right now.
Sure.
But how are we going to have your listeners or just the Catholic body take action from what you are saying or from what we share with Catholic Passage with all our content or just from what we hear at a Sunday homily? Mm-hmm. How do we, because that happens all the time, right? You read something, you listen to a 15-minute spiel from Father.
Sure.
And what do you do from that? It gives you warm feelings, or it's not supposed to though. And I've told Father Hughes this too. I thanked him one time after. I told him afterwards. I won't go into the details of it, but I did tell him one time after one particular homily. I said, you're going to probably hear some complaints, or you might have even seen some frowns or scowls out there. Mm-hmm. But thank you for that message because it was needed.
Yep.
Because the priests are not called to just make us feel good.
Right. Religion isn't good feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so. John of the Cross actually talks about this. He says he has this great point where he was talking about how when people are beginning to grow in the spiritual life, God will give them a lot of sensible consolation. So for example, you go to mass and like the host is raised and like you just are convicted. You're like, this is you're looking at the physical host. You're like, this is Jesus. So sensible consolation. Or like you see if they have incense and that the smell of it gets you into a spiritual mode. So there's a lot of sensory things. You look at a crucifix, but
there's also all the times you don't have that.
Right. It's not all the time, but he says those are the beginning things that God's trying to draw you into the spiritual life. And eventually what God's going to do is he's going to cut those away because the spiritual life is not about those things. It's about God.
Exactly.
So it'd be like an analogy I use sometimes. It's like you have a very wealthy friend who takes you out to dinner all the time. And let's say they pay all the time, right? The person just pays for dinner, their wealthy friend. And eventually though, you go out to dinner with them and you never offer to pay for them. It's all about them giving you the gift of the dinner rather than being with them as a friend.
Yeah.
Eventually they'll cut the dinner off and then it's going to cause a shock because you're going to say, well, wait a minute, like what has caused this? And that's kind of what God's doing. He's trying to get us to see that friendship with him is not contingent on consolations and good feelings, as you said. It's contingent on loving him for himself because he is the highest thing and highest triune community of persons. He is worthy of that love for everything he's given us. That's why Eucharist Thanksgiving. The love is from that Thanksgiving. Like, because John of the Cross says this. I wrote about this I did a peer-reviewed article on Philosophy 1 recently, and I brought in John of the Cross last year, and I made the point that John says God has multiple modes of presence with us, and one of them is he calls it presence by essence. And it basically says he's maintaining your existence at this very moment, and if he stopped, you would disappear, you'd be annihilated.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that alone, for someone like me, I'm like, thank you for letting me exist.
Yeah, right? I mean, to your analogy with the going out to supper thing at a fancy restaurant, I mean, God's doing that every day with us.
Absolutely.
And we're just too often focusing on the fancy aspect of it or the gifting. You know, we might be, thank you, God, for giving me this pay raise, or the things that are obvious. Like, thank you, God. And then when it's not going so well, or when we perceive it that way in the moment, we still have so much to be thankful for, no matter what.
Absolutely. And it's like, you know, I've realized recently is that like, with the cross, you know, we obviously the cross is painful and crosses in our own lives are painful, right? But there is a great joy in knowing that he's always there. Yeah. To know that no matter what, whether we're like John of the Cross locked in a former bathroom or, you know, we lost our job, you know, we have no friends, he is always there. And that for me is such a powerful thing that I'm like, I cannot not love you in return for that, because you have no reason meaning in himself. God is completely fine on his own, but he created out of love. He didn't have to do this. This was him freely choosing to do it. Now, yes, there's a lot of theologians who argue, well, the goodness, you know, he had so much goodness it overflows. St. Thomas talks about this. Sure, but that's still free of him. I'm not saying he doesn't make choices like you and I do. Obviously, that'd be anthropomorphizing him, but like meaning making him on our terms. I want to keep him on God's terms. But there's that freedom and love that he gave of himself for us that I think is just so amazing. I mean, I'm speechless. I don't know what to say. I thank you.
Well, that's what it has to start with.
That's also all I could say. Thanks. I don't, you know.
I mean, for anyone that's been struggling with how do they pray, well, just start with thanks.
Yeah.
It's been said before that the best way to learn how to pray is thank you and I love you.
Yeah. That's exactly, I can't say anything else. And I even think too that, you know, to your question about Catholic Passage or, you know, Midnight Carmelite and Luminous Tradition broadly, I think
the action, you mean?
Yeah, the action. I think that God loves you and he wants to be a part of your life. And anything he does or gives is for your good. And if you believe that, even the bad things he may permit, right? Even like, you know, yesterday I lost part of my keys and I was like, oh geez. But like, I really tried and I'm like, nope, if I lose everything on it and I can't find it, he's still in control and I moved on. Now, yes, his grace helped me do that. It wasn't from Andrew.
It would stink.
Right. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. And I've noticed in every moment in my life where I've done that, there's always a greater good on the other side.
Yep.
And I think that's to begin to act is to say, okay, this is not going to be roses and happiness all the time. It's going to be suffering. And it's suffering. And another good analogy I use is like athletic training. The fathers, even St. Paul, they talk about, I have to win the race. St. Paul talks about this in one of his letters. I've won the race, I've kept the faith, or whatever. That's the athletic training metaphor. It's that you go into practice someday, you don't want to be there. You're like, oh, I could do something else, I could do this. But you're doing it out of the fact that for the love of the sport and the love of your team, so sport and team in that case, that you're there to give your all that day as much as you can. And
none of us are sprinters.
Right.
We're all long distance.
It's all long distance, exactly. And so I think keeping that up and that consistency is one of the keys. Another thing I think as far as action is concerned is that people, like I said, pre-philosophical, theological, I think it's maybe, the discernment thing I think is a key thing like we were talking about earlier. I think it's a big struggle people have, because even when Cynthia finished her dissertation on prayer and action, one of the key parts of it was so I pray, but like, how does that translate to my action? Like I go and I sit in a room or go in my quiet space, I talk to God, and what does that really mean for my life? Well, what it shows is that, what she showed there is that, kind of, again, oversimplifying, is that you're growing in that. Like imagine you're at a table with your best friend, someone you've known for 20 years. You've had phone conversations, you've gone to parties, dinners, families have met each other. Like you have this long friendship, this long history, and you're sitting there and you're silent. You almost know what that friend is thinking. And that's what a saint's life analogously is with God. They know in a particular situation what to do because they are friends with him.
Yep.
They're real friends with him. They've suffered with him. And so, it takes time to build that relationship. And if you don't make the time for that, just like any friendship, it's going to wane. It's going to kind of float. But God's always ready. He's always waiting. And, he's, like I said, he's always there. So at any moment, you can turn around and say, okay, I need to start being better friends with God. I need to start growing in that friendship and having those conversations, which is prayer.
Actually, let's talk a little about that silence a little bit too.
Okay.
Just in that metaphor where you're talking about the silent friend sitting there.
Sure.
I think it's so important and I've mentioned this before too on maybe other episodes or even other content we've had, but the power of silence. And imagine you have this one friend who's really, really deep friend, right? Mm-hmm. Long term. He doesn't have to say something there.
No.
Then sometimes you have someone who is like, face level, like, I don't know, like a college friend. You go to parties together, you went to school together, whatever, you went to classes, surface level.
Yep.
When you get together, you guys are laughing, you're talking, but there's that friendship where if there's a little bit of silence, the other person has to say something just to go to the next thing. It might not even be what you're actually even talking about. They'll interject and start something up.
Right.
It's like you have to fill that.
Yep.
We're not called to have a relationship like that with God, where we just have to fill it. We have to just come up with the next thing to say. We're called more to have that deeper level where we are there and because you have to be open to receive. You have to be embracing the silence before you can actually hear him, whether you're literally hearing him or not.
So I think, the Samuel, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening, obviously, right? And I think what it is so for silence, you may feel like you're doing nothing in silence. You may feel like you're not going to hear anything. You're just going to, but the key is you're spending that time. And there's going to be times when, for listeners, there's different types of prayer, right? And so like Ignatius will talk about using your imagination, right? Like imagine you're with Christ. And Teresa of Avila even uses that when in her Way of Perfection, when she's talking about what she calls the prayer of recollection. So she's saying, if you're distracted, imagine this, and that'll focus you in on loving Christ.
I do that a lot because I have that problem where I'll get distracted. So I use
Right.
contemplative and imaginative prayer a lot.
Right. So, but then there's other people like me where my imagination isn't that good.
Oh, okay.
So I do what they're now calling the prayer of loving attention, which comes from St. John of the Cross, which is you're just focused on him, even though there's nothing there. There's no words, there's no concepts.
Yeah.
You just focus on being with him and you spend that time. And when something may come up, I'll say it, internally. I'll say, Lord, please help me with this. But most of the time is spent in that silence. So it's, because no concept can encapsulate God. In other words, he's beyond concept. He's agnosia it's a fancy Greek word, the unknowing. He's
like
beyond,
you said earlier, he's beyond that definition.
He's beyond that definition, right? So, So I think the thing for the listeners would be is to find, based on the type of person you are, what saint in the church or what method that will serve you best to be able to do what you're talking about, to do that listening.
There's not one cookie cutter way to do this, and we've done with some of our Catholic Passage retreats, like our Praying from Within retreat, where it's you are placing yourself within the Trinity.
Right.
And one of the examples we use there is like the praying like a pirate, ARG, ARRR. Have you heard that?
No.
Okay. Look it up on YouTube. It's just kind of corny with the ARG thing, but it's just an acronym there.
Okay.
A, acknowledge, R is relate.
Relate, okay.
R, the next R would be receive, and then the last one would be respond. There you go. Which is that kind of summarizes what we should do in prayer a lot of the times. You don't have to use that methodology, but it's a good way to simplify it out,
Yeah.
And in both ways that you and I are talking about, we're both drawing ourselves into, say, the page or what we are reading or just what we are contemplating on.
Yep.
Or what we're bringing to God
right.
of our own thoughts. And, for me, I might read something from Scripture and then I might put myself there. Very imaginative there, because I do have a very, very busy and active imagination. I'm going to imagine myself there. I'm going to imagine myself witnessing whatever, or sitting on a park bench next to Christ, literally talking to him, that kind of relationship. You are also drawing in just in a different way. And each person that might be listening to this, when they might practice this while they're driving.
Right.
That's where I've found, two things. They're both weird. They're not the cliche, like, sit in the church and pray in a pew by yourself at night all alone. That's the cliche thing you might see in a movie. Like you go in there, you're all alone, and it's quiet. And that doesn't always happen, and it's not realistically available for everybody either.
Right.
Okay, so pray when you're driving by yourself. You don't have to turn on the radio all the time.
Right.
I do a lot of prayer in the shower. It sounds weird, but you're by yourself, and it's relaxing there, and you have. What else are you going to think about, right?
Right, exactly. No, and I think all those, the Carmelites talk about this. Those little prayers are all prayer. In other words, just because you're not sitting down for an hour or a half an hour, you're doing it in the shower or while you're driving your car or like in a moment of frustration or in a moment of joy.
Yes. Yeah.
Like all those are prayer. And because remember, prayer is a communication with he who loves you. I think that's the definition.
Yeah.
And so it's like we're talking right now. It's simply saying, hey, Jesus, I love you. Or, hey, thank you for this. Or like, how do I deal with this? Even if it's a question that you ask and he's not giving you like a text message answer.
Yeah.
That's okay. Because again, you're there having the discussion and growing in that relationship.
Exactly. Like, what you and I are doing now, we're building on an already existing relationship.
Correct. Yep.
And every little bit counts.
Right.
It can also be the really long adoration time with Christ, or the weekend retreat.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be only that. And it's good if it isn't just that too, because we all have our daily lives, and do we want to be going the full length of the day where we have? Okay, if we truly believe that the most important relationship for us to have is with him, why wouldn't we be like crawling on our hands and knees to do anything we possibly can to get that and to bud that and to grow that?
Right. So
why aren't we striving for that more than we are?
Sure.
Because we're okay. We're complacent with an hour a week at church if we're doing that.
Right. So I think that's a great question. So number one, obviously we're fallen, right? So we're our directedness, I'm going to call it. So think of your attention like a vector. There's a speed and there's a direction, right? So like what we go towards and what we desire is the obvious. Oh, my life would be great if I had more money. Oh, if I had different types of food or more food, or if I had a bigger house, better car, like, there's the obvious kind of like surface level desires, right? And not to say that none of those things are good, and not to say that God doesn't desire those things for people.
Mm-hmm,
That's
exactly.
just, I'm simply saying that's one types of desire. But if those things aren't ordered to saying, okay, God crawling up to you, you're crawling on the hands and knees. Okay, God is the most important thing. He is the measure, like a ruler. I measure my life by him and what he thinks. Then do I need the bigger car? Then do I need the extra? Like, what do I need to answer his call and get those things? And then everything else belongs to him and to others. In other words, that's where charity comes in. You determine that. That's where I think today we don't think about those limits enough to use. In other words, what do I really need? And what goes out to everyone else and to God? And in other words, how do I give myself from what he's given me back to him and to others? And answering that question, I think and it's not like, oh, I have the answer, now I'm going to go do it. It's a lifelong process.
Exactly.
It's like, like we're talking about the podcast earlier, well, what are you going to do with it? Well, we don't know, generally speaking, but I still know that like whatever it is, whatever I do discern and whatever I do decide, that's his will, and that's fine. And that's the end of it. And there's a great book by Jean-Pierre Coussade, I think is his name. It's Ignatius Press published. It's called Abandonment to Divine Providence.
Oh,
Yeah, that book I think is very kind of a hidden, underrated book, because it's basically
it's on
saying,
my list right now.
Yeah, again, Catholics always recommend it. Read this book, read that book. That's the other thing I'd say, actually. What's been very helpful for me, like when I went back to earlier part of this conversation, when I was having the limit and trouble with philosophy, and I was like, I think there's more, and then I found John of the Cross, right? I always recommend to people, pray and find a saint to be friends with. Just pick one. And then just read what they wrote, see how they thought, and from what you read, imagine yourself how they would react, because they made it. We know they made it.
You don't need to do it all.
You don't need to do it all, and you don't need to do it identically, back to this uniformity thing. Just learn from them. And so like a good example I'll use myself is with John is, I like want to go through things, and I want to make it right, and like, what's this? And get it done at a specific time. And John says, look, God proceeds orderly and gently. So I immediately ask myself, like in my intellectual work, am I proceeding orderly and gently? Am I doing this in a way that is going to help others and be what God wants? And so then it slows me down to focus and bring God back into it. And, because you'll lose focus, right? Lose focus on him.
We always do.
And keep that focus on him and say, am I proceeding orderly and gently? That's just one example.
Exactly.
So.
And it's daily and throughout the day.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
It's constant. Just like when you were talking about the struggles, like with your keys deal. And I'm not trying to minimize it, but you could have something so much more. I feel like a good practice for people would be to, just like we're talking about here, you have to take it day by day and take those little things and work on that, so that when you go through the big things, you can then change. On the good side, like what we've been just talking about in the growth, but also through the bad. Like you are practicing with your little key thing, or when you stub your toe, or you someone elbows you as you get through a door, and you practice with that. But then when you have your trials and tribulations, like my wife and I, years long infertility struggle, or other things of long held crosses.
Yep.
What do you do with that? And you have to have been practiced to get up to that. I'm definitely not saying that we've been perfect through it, but
right. Yeah, but I think so. Like the funny thing about the keys is there's actually something really important on it.
Oh, okay.
It's funny.
Okay.
So as far as what you're talking about with like other things, I think you're absolutely correct on small things lead to big things. Yeah. Because if you're proceeding orderly and gently, you have to build the foundation out in order to get to the mountain. In other words, you
Yes.
don't climb a mountain overnight. You climb a mountain over a very long journey. And I think,
We're going to be climbing it on hands and knees,
right,
which is going to be really slow.
right. And
And
actually,
all those things of the world you were talking about, this is in my mind, I was thinking as you were describing with the
Sure.
cars, and I was just thinking, I was imagining myself literally climbing Mount Everest. Let's go with a tall mountain here.
Sure.
Hands and knees with these shorts that I'm wearing. So
That's
I'm going to
right.
have skin knees.
Yep.
It's going to be slow going.
Yep.
And there might be the worldly things along the way, the pizzazz, the car, the new house, with the things along the way.
Yep.
But as long as you still are looking up at the peak,
Yep.
and you're still climbing,
Yep.
you can pass through those things, and you don't have to, like, not, again, back to what we've said, not everyone is called to be a monk.
Correct.
We're not all called to literally wear like rags and have nothing in our pocket, in our wallet, let's say.
That's exactly right.
But we are called to try to climb that mountain and to strive for it.
Sure. So two things that come to mind. That's a great imagination there. That's in St. Faustina's diary. I don't remember where, but she had a vision where there was a mountain with all these storms on it and very rugged peaks. And then there were people who were partying in this field, and she looked over and saw the people partying going down into hell, and the people at the top of the mountain was like a paradise, and these people falling and struggling, bleeding on their knees, like you said, and they made it up there. So that, she talked about that image. That's a great image. The other thing too is that, back to living in rags and living like monks, if I decided tomorrow, okay, I'm taking all my books, I'm giving them to the poor, right? That's a good thing in itself. I'm selling my car, I'm doing this. Well, I'm a married man. I have an obligation to my wife, and
Exactly.
an obligation to what our marriage vocation is, an obligation to God's vocation for me as a scholar. If I give away my books, I can't do it anymore. So in other words, you need to have things.
You also can't help other people too.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of the scholarship, is to help others, to bring that light and clarity. And so then if I can't do that, then I've effectively gone against what I know he wants from that long relationship I've had. And I think that's the other thing, is that, like, there's a misconception sometimes where it's like, oh, I'm not doing enough, I need to, live this way or live that way. Well, no, you need to live within the church. There's all these different ways to live, many and varied ways ways to serve Christ. Find the way that God's calling you to and live it. It sounds oversimplified, but it's not. It actually
Nike,
is.
just do it.
Just do it. Exactly. And you're going to mess up along the way. You're going to say, like, I'm going to go in this direction. Oh, that was a dead end. Okay, let's trace back to where I know. Okay, let's move in this direction. It's never linear.
It's not a yellow brick road or a
Right.
neon sign. It's not going to be obvious. You're going to falter.
Nope.
I know I sure do.
Likewise. And so I think too, I would also say that, like, trying to find, people talk about reading the Bible to help, right? They say, like, read scripture.
Yep.
And I agree. I think find stuff like a book in the Bible you're interested in and pray over it.
But again, I just really like this point that I wanted to hone in on a little more. 5 minutes ago, you were saying, I brought up, don't do everything.
Yep.
Don't try to do everything.
Yep.
Pick one thing, because I don't know what you were going with this when you said this is a big issue in the Catholic faith or the Catholic community.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you meant, unless I was wrong on this, that the idea of, especially now, just this over content, which is great. It's a great problem that we have, Ascension Press and Hallow and all these things, and YouTube and the internet and
Yep.
and your stuff,
Yep.
all the things.
Yep.
Catholic Passage,
Right.
all the content.
Right.
But most people, most Catholics, most atheists, most everybody are content consumers.
Right.
We're not content creators. Not everybody is. I mean, they're out there.
Right.
But most content creators are just trying to make a buck too. Let's be honest.
That's right. Yeah.
When I say content creators, I mean action creation.
Okay.
It's more than just a YouTube star. I mean, we're taking what we're consuming, we're
Yep.
going to chew on it a bit, and we're going to go out with it. And that goes back to our whole question of this action. But something I've pondered too with our Catholic Passage ministries is we're trying to raise up, well, one, we got the main mission of
Sure.
helping teachers and parents, pass on the faith and way of life to their children and students, of course. But then there's also kind of other main mission is that we are trying to raise, because we are lay led. The
Right.
whole board is lay led. We have Father Feller on board, but it's lay led. We are trying to raise up other lay people in their involvements, whether it's in-person stuff or content.
Right.
And that's a testimony. And whether you, the listener, calls us up or emails us and say, hey, I would really like to do something with you guys. I want to be on, do this one thing or do that. I want to be involved. Whether you do that or whether you are just a witness in your own home, with your own family. That's a real thing too, and that starts something with those small changes. Back to our point here on building it, whether it's through the trials and tribulations. Okay, I keep going back to your key. I'm picking on you because it's a small thing, but apparently it wasn't a big thing.
No,
it was a big
it's
thing.
Funny, there would have been a small thing except for that one thing on it, but go ahead.
Yeah, the stubbing the toe. How about that?
Yeah.
It's a fleeting pain, and then it's kind of over.
Yeah.
For the most part, versus years long cross. But then also on the good side, we're just chatting for a little bit here.
Right.
You might chat with God in the shower for a little bit.
Right.
But then there's also that long journey up the mountain.
Right.
It's the whole lifelong thing. You need the small changes. You need the small goals and what you're going to strive for to be able to even make it up half the mountain, let alone, the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to your point about the overconsumption of things, that the availability of things almost creates a, like deer in the headlights, like you don't know where to start.
Or drinking from the fire hose kind of thing.
Yeah. I had a friend who went to a Catholic bookstore and he said, I want to find an answer to my question. Well, he looks at the books on the shelves and there's no book having the answer to the question. So he picked a book out, I won't say which, and he gets home and he started looking through it and he's like, this doesn't answer my question, and on the shelf it goes. And so there's one thing I definitely think is out there is that people have their own particular questions on God's call for them, and prayer is the primary way to solve that problem. But what we're doing is we're going to books and all these other things instead of going to prayer.
It's easier.
Because it's easier, right?
It's easier to look on our phone or on a computer, on a YouTube thing, or to Google something, or listen to a Father Mike Schmidt's homily or something.
Right, and I think there's also like we talked about earlier about how it's love based, not intellect based.
Yep.
That doesn't mean the intellect isn't involved. It doesn't mean you shouldn't read and read. There's many amazing books that'll help that love. But that's all in the service of the love.
Aren't we back to that whole thing where you're talking about with the eyes and the mind thing a little bit? We're just kind of taking it in with our eyes, but what are we going to do with it beyond that?
Yeah, well, and I think that Christ. I think it's in the Gospel of Mark where he says, you worship me with your lips, but your hearts are kept far from me. You teach the traditions of men, but you're not teaching the traditions of God. And I think in all of us, there's this tendency to forget that God wants our heart. You could be, like St. Paul says, if you speak in the tongue of the angels and of men, but you have not love, you're nothing. I mean, I could write the most brilliant philosophical paper that changes the field of philosophy, but if I don't have love, I'm worthless in God's eyes.
Yep.
And I think that, again, goes back to Therese with the flowers.
Yeah, I was just going to say with the simple love.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this super high scholarly mind. She just has that raw love.
And I think too, St. Augustine, I think it's book 1 on Christian, it's sometimes translated as on Christian teaching, but De Doctrina Christiana, he talks about charity. And it's a fascinating passage where he says, and I'm kind of summarizing, he says, let's say you have 2 people in front of you and you have to decide who to give charitably to, and they're both your neighbor. You kind of roll a dice, basically. You're like, well, this one or this one. Like, there's no distinguishing factor. You would roll a dice, is he saying. But he's saying if one's nearer to you by proximity, but one's further from you, your obligation is to the one nearer to you, because that's the one who's closest to your own life. So, in other words, your family, your spouse, your friends, your coworkers, all of those are opportunities for that charity nearby. In fact, the word neighbor in Greek, I think it's tom plesion. It's the nearby. It's an adverbial noun, I believe. And so it's that those who are nearby, those are the ones God put in your life for you to love him and love them, love God, love your neighbor. And so it's easy to do in the sense of you don't have to go far to do it. You can start right now.
Yeah. Now we just need to get the listener to do that, right? And us. We're talking to each other, too.
Absolutely.
We're talking to ourselves.
Yeah, I haven't climbed the mountain. So.
Exactly. No, I'm still at the bottom. I'm still at the bottom. I got my hands up and my knees are already scuffed.
Yeah, I'm not able to say John of the Cross has his drawing. He says, all things for the honor and glory of God. So that's what I try and do in my life, but I don't.
What's the drawing?
He has a sketch of the ascent of Mount Carmel, and there's 3 paths.
Oh.
And the only path that gets to the top of the mountain is, in Spanish, is nada, 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 nada. And then it says at the top of the mountain is everything for the honor and glory of God. And then it has, some other things around it. And that's kind of how I measure myself. As I say, am I doing it for him or am I doing it for myself? So.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah. And the thing is that idea of nada is he's not saying nothing as in, again, you don't have cars and a house if you're married. You have things that are appropriate to your state in life and no excess, what he calls attachments, which he uses this metaphor of a bird that has a string on its leg attached to a fence. And he says, if you have one single attachment, even if it's a very thin string, you'll never be able to fly. You have to cut them all and then you can fly. So, and I think that's another problem we struggle with today is we create these attachments because of, like, you have our culture, you have, the issues we're dealing with, you have just, like I said, pre-philosophical, theological. It's all that blends together to create an environment that I think it makes it a little easier to form those today.
That really speaks to me. I'm that bird.
Okay.
I'm that pigeon. I'm gonna say a pigeon because I'm gonna look at it in a negative light.
Sure.
I hate pigeons.
You hate pigeons. Okay.
Yeah. The farm is full of them. So, but
Okay.
I'm gonna imagine myself in that negative light I'm the pigeon with that string.
Okay.
Because I feel like it's probably not a chain.
No.
It's literally just a string.
That's what he says. It could be the thinnest string. Yep.
Because I'm flapping. I'm trying.
Yep.
I'm doing the things.
Yep.
I'm absorbing the content. I'm striving for that action.
Yep.
But I know deep in my heart, as we're talking here, that I do have some attachment issues.
Yeah, we all do. And I think that identifying those, John of the Cross would say, is the big step forward in the spiritual life. Find where those attachments are. And he says, this is what I love about him. He's like kind of ruthless. He says, throw it out. Just like it is not God, throw it out.
And that's where I struggle because I could probably tell you just, like on a hand or something, oh, this one and this one probably and this. And a lot of it has to do with, but then I can't throw it out because I rationalize. I do the things like, well, okay, so as a farmer, as a business owner, I'm like, well, I need this for business, or do I need it?
Right.
Or is it helping me? And then why am I wanting it? Because it's going to make me more money, or it's going to make me be more efficient as a business owner. But what does that have to do with striving for for sainthood?
Exactly. And I think too, you have to remember that those things, that thing in God's call, to use your example, there may have been, everything's temporal. So there may be a time when that's right for you, but there may come a time where it needs to go, and then it becomes, you see what I'm saying? Like, in other words, it wasn't an attachment when you got it, let's say, but it became an attachment later for whatever reason. Like, in other words, it's beyond the scope of where God's calling you to right now.
And I would speculate the idea that I'm even thinking about it now, or the fact that it's like in the back of my head, like that's kind of telling me that maybe it's like the now, or at least it wasn't before, because I didn't contemplate.
But then I think too that the other thing, remember, is like we're talking about with Saint Ignatius and Satan, is this is a good thing. So then that's why for me, like I'm not trying to project it, but like I tend to be, I'm like, that's why I resonate with John so much, because I'm that ruthless. The second I feel like something's, I'm just like, it's gone, like it's out. That I do not hesitate. That's my personality. But the problem is there's been times where I'm like, actually, I jumped the gun. Yeah. Exactly. I should have waited and been patient, and I was impatient because I was thinking that I was getting rid of it, an attachment, but actually I was tricked, and that's on me. So,
okay, so here's an example.
Sure.
I've been very involved with Catholic Passage.
Sure.
As president on the board, but just from the start, when it was just kind of Father Feller and I doing a lot of the legwork, and then we were grabbing in people. But just from the start and throughout this whole time, I'm like, I'm doing this. I'm also leading up this. I'm also heading this because why? Because no one else wants to do it, or no one has the abilities or interest, whatever. So I'm heading up this. I'm doing this. Well, I've felt at times, or even pressure, outside pressure from other people, like, okay, you're spending too much time with this and you're not getting paid. I'm not looking to get paid. That's the whole point. It's sure. Or, and I should get rid of this. I should cut it out because there's something else that's important. Well, like balance. Like balance with family life, balance with work too. But you got to have time for all those things. You got to have time for your spouse. But ultimately what I'm discovering is that I don't need to cut out the good thing that is with this. I just need to find a better way to balance and maybe cut something different out. Yeah. And balance let's say the two. I'm simplifying it, but say the two good things or the multiples.
So I think, exactly. And that's what you'd bring to prayer and try. Because remember, it's not like a horizontal plane.
Exactly.
It's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
So in other words, for example, your marriage and my marriage, that's like top. I mean, there's God and there's our spouse. That's what I mean. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
And then other things below that, like say your work, my work.
Exactly.
Those are below family.
Right.
But they are ordered higher than, say, business maybe.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So it's like, right. So I think, so it depends. So you can make an argument. You can say, well, for your marriage is your business and what, like, your, let's say, financial grant. Yes, you can provide. Are you not living up to that? I'm not saying you are, by the way, at all. I'm just hypothetical. Let's say you're not living up to your vocation to provide. And
then I do need to back off.
Right. And again, then this is why it's so confusing today. Then people think provide, does that mean money only? No, it means your presence primarily. It means and so that's another thing we have today with our culture, where with capital, and I'm not saying this against capitalism, like a laissez-faire capitalism.
Money focus.
If money is your sole driver, then you're never even going to, number one, make a ministry decision, because everything's going to be determined on money. And like you said, if the ministry is not about the money, then that hypothetical person would never even consider that, even though it may be what they're called to. And to bring it to your case, then you're saying, okay, well, of what you said is business and what you said of ministry, and here's my marriage, like a triangle, right? And the marriage in this case is the focus point of your whole life, right? Hierarchically ordered to God. Then you'd make the decision, you'd pray and say, well, is in one of these two things, is that better serving my marriage?
Yeah.
And then that's where the decision comes. So
again, it's a hierarchy.
Yeah. Cause for me, for example, there were times when, on a personal level, I remember I was like, well, maybe I should, tone back the scholarship because, I could do more IT work. And Cynthia was like, no. Provide more. Yeah. Cynthia was like, no. And she was like, absolutely not. Like, I want you to do this. And I prayed about it and I'm like, okay, yep. And so there's a trade-off, right? Yeah. Like if I'm publishing peer-reviewed articles, those don't pay me. Yeah. But that's what I feel God's calling me to. So I do it. And I've noticed too.
But again, back to your point.
Yep.
And she was recognizing this.
Right.
God bless Cynthia, that she was recognizing that you providing for her wasn't just the focus of the money.
Correct.
You're through this other work, through the scholarship, you're actually providing for her and others,
right,
and others too, in a greater way than if you were just, I'm only going to do the IT work. I'm going to delve myself into this office work. And in fact, I'm going to get rid of the scholarship. I'm going to just do all these things. Right. And I'm going to provide monetarily.
Right.
But you'd be more lax, actually, on the personhood side.
Exactly. That's a good way of saying, because within yourself too. So like there's a subjective and objective dimension of this. Within myself, from prayer and from discernment, I know that the philosophical scholarship is crucial to, frankly, my holiness. In other words, it's helping me be more holy. In other words, I've seen the fruits. You know it by your fruits. I've seen the fruits of that in myself and in others. So subjective dimension self, objective dimension others. And we're all related. So that's also a place to help discern, is to say, all right, what is the fruit of this in that hierarchy? for my marriage and for the people nearby, and how is this working? And then you over time you'll start to see, and we're wired this way. That's why God gave us reason. John of the Cross says the only thing you need to be saved is reason and the law and doctrine of the gospel. Why? Because you'll see how Christ sees, and then you'll take your reason. Obviously, you don't take your reason, you use it, but you'll use your reason to look at these things like we're talking about right now, and take the time to really discern, meaning judge and put together and organize what's going on. Is Satan trying to trick you with some good? Are you missing something that you didn't take the time to sit down and see? And now when you put it together, you're like, oh,
distraction,
total blind spot. Exactly. So those are all the things that go into this. It's not, there's a metaphor I've used for some time. It's not like you get on a train and you're on the Catholic train track and you're just shoveling coal and doing the same thing over and over. And the train tracks. It's
like the cartoon where you're just going up.
Yeah, the cartoon. Exactly. No, it's climbing the mountain, to use your metaphor, which is a dynamic activity. You're trying to, okay, do I go to this ledge or do I jump over here? What do I do?
It's dynamic, but there's also, it's very heady too. You're constantly rock climbing. I'm not a rock climber, but I've done the wall with the plastic ones, at least at YMCA. That's about it. I'm not doing free climbing or anything. But, and I'm assuming you haven't either.
No.
But it's like that.
I'm a water creature. I'm a swimmer. I'm like, it's funny. This is I'm convinced this is other swimmers may get mad at this. I'm convinced that being a swimmer my whole life since I was 4 has made me land uncoordinated. But anyway, sorry.
Maybe you evolved.
I've evolved, exactly. I'm just put me in the water. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. I know I said don't want rock climb.
So no, I'm trying to think how I can use your under the water side. It doesn't work as good because it's so much more open. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of just swim wherever you want. You can turn any direction and you're probably okay. And then you can spin around literally under the water.
You use the water as a metaphor? So I would say the way to do that would be to say, okay, at what given time, you have lane lines. Am I swimming in my lane, and what's going on in my lane? What stroke am I doing? Am I doing kicking? Am I doing pulling? Am I, how fast am I going? When am I stopping and resting? When how do I divide up my...
But it is ordered.
Correct.
So you can do it with a pool, and the climbing works, obviously.
The climbing's easier.
Okay.
It's a way better metaphor, I think, for this.
I gotta reach for this one, and there's constant mind and heart involvement.
Yep.
It's not like being scuba diving, and then the wide ocean, think you're in Finding Nemo, put yourself down there and you're wide open, clear blue sky, clear blue underneath the ocean, not sky. And you could literally swim to the left, right, forward, behind, spin around, and move, and then not even actually move because you could just spin and stay in one spot, and it's all okay.
Yeah,
but that's not what it's
so
like.
I think if we take that metaphor as those two metaphors as the directedness to God, so under the metaphor is how is the directedness of God like? It's like climbing a mountain where you have to make these decisions and you're going up.
Yes.
Whereas if you're in the water, you can spin.
But what I was wanting to go with that is I feel like a lot of us, culture tries to drive us into going through life under the water, that way, where it's just wide open, carefree, and whatever direction you want. And again, I say with Finding Nemo because it's I'm thinking of Lake Okoboji right here. You can't see underneath that. It's dark and full of kelp or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm saying the perfect cartoonish, pure, brilliant blue underneath where you can see for quote unquote kilometers or whatever.
Right. Exactly. So I think you're right. The culture does push that because everyone is their own master. They don't answer. In other words, it's my life. It's my choice. It's a first person where we are responsible for our choices. Where in my work I call human beings transcendent, self-ordering free agents. It's just a fancy way of saying we can direct ourselves to whatever we want. We can point ourselves, but the question is, what do we ought to point ourselves at?
Yep.
And I think that so today it's. The question with the ocean is, can I point myself somewhere? Yeah, of course. You have options.
Can or may.
Yeah, exactly. Can or may, but the question should be ought.
Yes, bingo.
So, yeah.
I ought to climb that mountain.
Because God's at the top.
Yeah.
Because he's worth it. Same for I ought to make this decision for my marriage because it's for the good of my wife and my kids, if you have kids. I ought to be kind and merciful to others because that's how I will be like Christ, because that's what he was. And I think
Yeah, and as you go through daily life, especially with like the latter couple examples, you might be tested in at times with your anger or just your mood, or what am I going to choose in this moment? Could I do this?
Right.
May I do this?
Yep.
Or ought I do this?
Ought I do this? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that,
and if there is an ought, and I don't know I don't know if every decision, like small decision in daily life, I don't know if everyone has an ought.
Well, to have an ought, so any human action is a moral action, and all moral actions have an ought. But
so they all have oughts.
So like, I mean, if you think about it, even eating, you can eat junk food or you can eat healthier. And that's
what about when I'm at the buffet again, when you're using that earlier analogy? And yeah, I could overindulge. That's not the ought. But what if I choose the grape or the banana? I mean, that's not an ought, right?
No, I don't think. I think in that case, there may be, I would argue, there may be like I'm going to use a fancy word, there may be a metaphysical ought, meaning like if you knew in your body at that time that eating grapes or eating like cantaloupe, or I forgot the other fruit was, whatever. But I'll use cantaloupe and grapes. Cantaloupe and grapes, if you're picking between the two, maybe one would be better for there, but it's the ought, the qualitative greatness of the ought, meaning like that's low. Like
the other side of this wall, the entrance to this church has 3 doors, right? Mm-hmm. It's the classic metaphor with the door thing. Do I ought go through the middle door?
No, I think in that case you can pick the door because your goal is to get through the door.
And that was what I was getting at when I said not every little decision you make throughout the day is going to have an ought. It might just be a can. Sometimes you can't walk through the middle door because there's a gazillion people coming out and you're going in the church at the same time.
Oh yeah. So right. So
and then but there might be a may.
Right. So I think
I may go through the right door, but there isn't an ought for that.
Well, so I think that assuming in this hypothetical example, all the doors are identical.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Okay.
And they are.
So in the case of the grapes and the cantaloupes, they're not identical. So when I use the term metaphysical, I'm saying objectively, even without you knowing, so there's no volition involved with you. Like in other words, you don't have the information to make the decision that grapes or cantaloupes is better.
You just walked into the
You just walked in and you picked one. I wouldn't really worry about it. There may have been a nutritional ought for you that you didn't know about, but in the sense that like it would be better for you is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there's a volitional ought, so that's why I'm making a distinction between volitional and metaphysical.
I should have used a better example. My whole point was to try to really simplify it and make the point that
there are decisions you don't have to sit around and worry about the ought.
Yes. That's my main point.
Yeah.
3 minutes later, we're talking to a scholar here, folks.
Yeah, right, exactly. No, I have to flesh everything out. Sorry, everyone.
Come on, man. Get my point.
Yeah.
3 doors. No, sorry, I'm just picking here. But the point is that as we go throughout the day, we do have to remember, Matthew, we can worry about tomorrow. We don't have to.
Yeah, and I think you only have so much energy. So if you're sitting around worrying about grapes or cantaloupe, you're using energy on something you ought to be using on something more important. You're wasting it.
Physical energy,
yeah,
our mind and our heart too.
Right.
We can fill our heart with love of not good things.
And if like for example, if something bad happens and you like continuously like ruminate about it, you're wasting your energy on ruminating about that bad thing, which you may be justified in the sense of justice that you shouldn't have had that bad thing happen, but there's nothing you can do about it. So it's better to surrender it to the Lord and work with him to spend the energy on how he wants you to react and where he wants you ought to go, rather than, saying, oh, and this person hurt me or this happened to me and it's not my fault. And
a really good example right now would be like the Middle East conflict right now.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole Iran-Israel thing.
Mm-hmm.
You and I, and I would assume everybody listening to this, but who knows who's listening, has nothing to do with the situation and can't actually do anything. Nope. Should we be praying about it? Should we be somewhat involved indirectly and obviously willing peace, willing the good of the end of the conflict, whatever have you.
Yep.
But ruminating on it, like refreshing our Twitter feed, refreshing the news, constantly checking in on it, like subscribing and following every single news outlets so that we can get the news. I give these examples because I kind of half almost went that way to some degree. And it was partly because, well, I'll just say when it first started happening, it was affecting the markets a little bit. And I don't even mean the equities. I mean just literally like cattle crashed.
Cattle crash. Okay.
And so it was like affecting me, and I was worrying about it.
Yep.
And so I was like, okay, I gotta focus on this. I gotta obsess over this,
Right.
and follow every single thing the president says or the next news thing.
Right.
And I was ruminating on it so much it was stressing me out.
Yep.
I was wasting that energy.
Yep.
And eventually I just realized like I can't change anything, and me knowing every detail actually doesn't do me any good.
Yep.
It's actually affecting how much energy I can give to the other people. Again, that hierarchy, the people in my life that matter the most.
Yep.
I gotta shut all that out. I gotta cut it out.
Yeah, and I think thinking about it that way is great, because you can apply that to just about anything we obsess about that we have no control over, right? That's a great example. And the energy that you know, in the case that you talked about that you put into it, think of, you know, not like picking on you in any way, but if you think of what could, and I've done this too, we've all done this, you know, how can we have spent that energy for the glory of God and for helping others?
Yes.
It's that simple. And if you don't do that, and again, you're going to fall. And I think what happens is Satan sometimes will come to you and say, oh, look, you fell. Like, look at what you did. Like, here's the baseball bat. Start pounding yourself over the head with it for being a bad person.
Despair time.
Despair time. And you're using the energy, beating yourself up, using energy. You know, it's like a double hit. And instead of like moving forward with the Lord and saying, I'm sorry, he says, I forgive you, and off you go.
Slapstick humor, maybe like Home Alone or something. You step on the rake, and then you're like, ow, and then you turn around, and then you then get hit by the rake again.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Proverbs talks about this. You know, if you get yourself fooled twice, it's probably a bad thing. You're probably doing something wrong. And I think that's it's important to remember that God wants to build you up, and he wants to make you in the image of his son. And that's going to be varied in many, like the flowers. But if you're sitting there like, you know, ripping your own petals off, pardon the metaphor, that's not helping anything. You know, you're making it worse.
Well, and then you're not a daisy anymore. Going back to the rose, and we should be just fine being daisies.
Right.
But if we rip all our petals off, we're just the inside.
Right. Exactly.
We're exposed.
Yeah, you expose yourself. So.
Yeah, and we don't want to do that.
No,
because I mean, more vulnerable you are. Yes, we want to be vulnerable with who we trust, and ultimately Christ. But if you are just exposed in the world, let's say, out into the open air, like a daisy, then I mean, you're going to be much more susceptible to spiritual warfare too.
For sure, and even too, think of it in the case of just remembering. So if you think about the wrong that happened, or what you did wrong in this case, and you remember it, you're bringing that into your presence. It's your conscious awareness is now aware of it. You're thinking about it, and you're going through the details about what you did wrong and all these other things. Think about the amount of energy you're spending. Not only is it the energy of your directedness of pulling this memory into your conscious awareness to think about it and deal with it, you're then going through all these details about what you did wrong. Oh, I could have done that here. Why didn't I say that? Oh, I'm so bad. You know, bad me. And what are you doing? You're not living towards Christ at that point. You're like turned in on yourself, beating yourself up.
Well, actually, yeah, the evil one wants you to do that.
Right. Exactly. He inverts you. He likes to invert things. So if in this case, he's inverted you on yourself to beat you up about what you did wrong in order to keep you from moving forward and growing in what's right.
Because you didn't get anywhere out of that.
Right.
You know, okay, back to our metaphor of we're climbing up the mountain, back to that again. You missed the rock, and you fail, and then you slip. You slip backwards, and you catch yourself.
Yep.
So you're a couple feet down from where you were.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, whew. After you get your breather, you start beating yourself up, not physically, but like mentally. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed that. I almost died. It's my fault.
Yep.
And then you are so panicked of that, you then spend the rest of the day, and you don't go forward again.
Yep. And that's what's so important too, I think. Having good friendships, so you can talk with good, friends about this, and say like, hey, this is what happened and this is what I did. Like, it's not confession. What it is, it's helping to get their perspective, because they may pull you out of it too, because you'll talk to them about that and they'll say like, actually, how you look at that, that's not what actually happened from my perspective. It was X, Y, Z. Exactly. And then you're like, oh, like, you're right. Like, I totally like misremembered or like misunderstood or whatever. And that we're all kind of helping each other climb that mountain. That's the church, the people of God, the ecclesia. Comes from Hebrew, the kahal, the tribe of Christ. Like, yes, it has the institution, but the institution derives from the people gathered around him as his mystical body. And I think having that companionship when these types of things happen, when you slip down the mountain, is really important.
We may climb the mountain by ourselves. We might even prefer it. But we do need the others around us to have that eagle-eye view from the side or from below. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we can climb the mountain with others. Yeah, and
they're going to reach down and grab you. You're going to reach down and grab them. Right. You may start to slip and they stop you.
They can be your lanyard.
Yep. So, absolutely.
Yeah. I found that, well, I'm naturally an introvert.
Okay.
I'm assuming you are
Me
too.
Are, yep.
Yeah, obviously. Yep. So I recharge my batteries alone. I can be what I used to describe as extroverted. Basically, I can be a talker. I can talk with lots of people. I can be at the social scene. I can talk with lots of people. I don't get anxious about large crowds, let's say, necessarily, but I do need to come away from that and recharge my batteries alone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times I do, like throughout the majority of a day's time, like during the work week, I kind of prefer to work alone because then I can ultimately usually multitask. Whatever I'm doing with my hands, because my job usually is very hands-on.
Yep.
My mind can be at least partially, at a minimum, free to contemplate, think, even pray about other things during all that time.
Right.
And if I'm with a lot of others, or even just a couple other people, I usually don't have that same ability. I do enjoy the value of working alone, just like I might draw into that tendency to try to climb that mountain by myself.
Right.
A lot of times. So I think I have to remind myself that I do need the others, from my spouse to spiritual guidance from like pastors that I know, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like I'm the same way. Like I need to have my time by myself to read and to think and just to kind of there's something decompressing about that, I think, for an introvert. But I have to remind myself that that's my psychology. That's not my spirituality. In other words, what I mean is that we're all called to live for others. And if I need to recharge, then I'm doing a good for others by doing that. In other words, that there's that time I need to set aside to do that, because that will allow me, like Jesus prayed and went alone up in the mountain. It's like that. There's nothing wrong with that per se, which was a struggle I had for a while. I kept trying to make myself available to people because I felt that, well, I may be an introvert and I need this, but they need me now. But sometimes you have to draw that line and be able to say no, back to the hierarchy. If I go and do that, it's going to not serve the hierarchical needs of what I'm called to. And then that's going to be ultimately a detriment to my growth rather than a aid. And I think, so again, and you can see this if someone says, for example, to be Catholic means to be super social. I mean, it's hypothetical, but like that doesn't, that's not the same for everyone. Again, it goes many and varied other ways to serve Christ. You have to find, based on your psychology, based on what God's calling you to, based on your vocation in life, professionally, spiritually, and those types of things. You kind of have to order that all and figure it out.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more too. We all can have these different personalities, and even our psychology, individualized. Exactly. But it would be too much to say that all of our spiritualities are sort of extroverted, like they're in that they are other people focused. They're others focused.
So I would say
I would use
the term gift rather than extroversion, because extroversion is I would say gift, because what you're doing is you're personally giving yourself to the other.
Yeah, and I was simplifying it. But.
Oh, okay. But I would say it's your gift is the best. And in fact, the communio theologians, Larry Chapin, they're big on this idea of gift. I think there's a guy named Father Antonio Lopez wrote scholarly book called, I think it's like The Gift of Being or something. And he goes into this theology of gift. I've read parts of it. I've never read the whole thing, but I think there's something there, is that if you look at your Catholic life as a gift, and you're a gift to others, you're a gift to that hierarchy.
It's both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a helpful way to look at it too.
Yep. No, and that is how I meant when I said extroverted, but I was obviously simplifying the term. I just like the idea of, again, in a very simplistic way, you can say, oh yeah, I'm an introvert, but ultimately, because both of us are, but ultimately, when it comes to our spirituality, we have to be others focused.
Yeah, so exactly. I see what you meant. Yeah. No, it's always others focused, God focused, because all the things that God gives us in prayer and in our spiritual lives is meant for building up his kingdom and for others.
Yes. And to build that kingdom, we have to share.
Exactly.
We have to share once. We can't just keep it all bottled up.
Well, there's Bishop Sheen talked about this. You heard the Dead Sea metaphor.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking here. Is
why don't you talk on that a little bit?
Sure. So he talked about how the Dead Sea, the water goes in, but nothing goes out. And because of that, the water becomes thick and stagnant, and there's no life in it. Whereas when you have a normal body of water, water goes in, water goes out, and it keeps it fresh and it allows life to be cultivated. So it's a good metaphor for the spiritual life, is that you have to, whatever's come into you, whatever gifts you've given, it's meant to flow out ultimately, given back to God and others.
Yeah, so. Even on the farmer side, or people might know from they're on the area, the rural life, you have kind of like dead or stagnant soil even too.
Okay.
Like, so last year was so wet, right? And you had fields flooded, ground was saturated with water. It couldn't become oxygenated. It couldn't breathe.
Sure.
And nothing grew from that. Even the weeds. Well, eventually the weeds grew. But if you didn't come back and till it up, I mean, even the no-till guys would actually come back later and till that up, till the soil to allow air to flow through it. Because people don't realize that either, that soil is porous. There is oxygen flowing through there. It has to breathe. If it's too compressed, and just major compaction. Imagine a big crane driving over something.
Sure.
You're not going to have anything grow there.
Right.
And that can be how we can be too. We can be so compacted and just so, lifeless, stagnant, no oxygen, can't breathe, that we're not able to we're not going to be able to share because we've been so closed up and resilient.
That's a great metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a great metaphor too, because if you're thinking of oxygen like breath, like the Holy Spirit, you have to make room within yourself to have the Holy Spirit come through.
Well, again, it's the in and out.
Yeah.
You have to be open enough to have the Holy Spirit come into you for anything to be coming out and to share.
Yep.
And to have you be a vessel,
right. Yep.
In that work. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, and again, I just think it's especially tough today because everything's been so flattened that the pre philosophical theological soil, to use the compact metaphor, it's been compacted down that there's no room to breathe, because you can't, if you're acknowledging the ought, and if you're in other words, that given the plethora of choices that there's a best choice, then that's directly against where our current culture is today, which is no, you make the choice, and any choice you make is good.
Yeah, and ultimately those other choices of the culture, let's just say, picking on the culture a lot today, is that those are going to be the crane that's compacting it, just keeping you in yourself.
Yep.
Very self-focused, compacted, not oxygenated, not open to give of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll talk about the one positive thing in the culture today, I think, is the internet. I think for all its problems, what it has done is it has allowed global communication, and so that there's ways to hear, if it's within the scope of what we're talking about, it's ways to hear things and learn from people that you never would have encountered. So I'll use myself as an example. So the professors in School of Philosophy I was trained in, they were all Thomists. They were existential Thomists, so in the vein of Jill Sohn. And they started working with the Thomists in Lublin, and I think Lublin, Poland.
Oh, okay.
That's where St. John Paul II Catholic University Lublin, that's where John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, he, after the Second World War, Father Krumpietz hired Karol Wojtyła to do ethics in Lublin after basically the department was decimated by the war.
Oh, okay.
And so Lublin is the place where he taught ethics and in philosophy for years before he became a bishop and then
ultimately, yeah.
Pope, yeah. So they connected with this group, and I have friends there who I have only met through Zoom video call. No, we don't use Zoom, but video call.
Yeah.
And we exchange scholarship. We were friends, and I would have never met them if it wasn't for that, and they would have never connected with them. I mean, they may have gone there for a conference, let's say, but it would be a relationship by letter. It wouldn't be a relationship like, hey, let's hop on a video call like I do with them. I'll hop on with my friends, scholar friends from here and scholar friends from Poland, and we'll talk about the culture and philosophy and where things are going.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful thing, because it allows for it allows for people who, when the culture may not allow them to have a voice, to have a place to discuss these things and have a voice. So I think it's really important.
Counterpoint here is that I feel like the internet's, when you flip up that toolbox, like tool chest that I referenced earlier,
Yep.
and you have all the tools on top, all
Yep.
laid out,
Yep.
and you got to pick the right tool for the right issue. I'm going to say the internet's like the hammer right on top that we just go to grab every time.
Oh yeah, I think it definitely be used. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, you grab it every time because it's easy and it's convenient,
Yep.
especially now. And hammer seems like it could be used for a lot of things.
Yep.
And a lot of times you do have a nail to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you're using it to, what did you say, scrape paint off or something
Or
like that.
scrape the wood,
Yeah.
shave the wood or something.
Yeah, do something like that where it could work, but it might not be the right tool. And I just say that because there could be a lot of bad that comes from the internet too.
Yeah, though there definitely is a lot of bad from the internet. I mean, I totally agree with that, and I think if just like you're saying it's a tool can be used responsibly or irresponsibly.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. And I think
we shouldn't get rid of it. We don't need to cut out.
For sure.
You need the hammer. You need
Right.
the internet.
Right.
But it's not always your go-to. And sometimes in the moment, you might need to discern, okay, am I being called to, okay, you have some spare time, and do I need to, because boredom leads to bad things sometimes, right? Okay, do I just ultimately go to social media? Let's use that example.
Sure.
And just scroll, and then become ultimately, or YouTube, whatever, and you ultimately dive down a deep hole and you get drawn into something.
Like doom scrolling we're talking about here?
Yeah,
sure.
Okay. Yeah. Where, again, it wastes of time. You could be using that time, that energy
For sure.
elsewhere, and ultimately you might become drawn into something with temptation or something bad like that.
No, absolutely.
I'm not trying to
No, I know you're not.
Evil.
No, you're.
I'm just saying the example of how this often happens when you have that spare time and you happen to be sitting in a room like we are right now, where there's literally tons of books,
Yep.
and you could use that same amount of time and pull open something that you know for a fact is good and holy, and going to derive. You're going to drive something positive from that.
Yeah, that I think you're 100% right on that. Bishop Sheen, I forget which talk it was. It was one of his Life is Worth Living TV shows. He talked about he was about to quote Lady Macbeth from the play Macbeth, and he paused and he said, and again I'm summarizing. He said, "You have to always be careful what images and words you expose yourself to, because you're just going to take it in. Like if someone shows up and shows you something and your eyes are just going to do their job, like I was talking about earlier with the stick in the water.
Yeah.
They're just going to do their job. And if you're scrolling on the internet and you see some picture that you probably shouldn't have seen, you can scroll by, you can turn it off, but that's going to, and it may, like someone's social media post, it could be anything. You'll see that. That's, you put yourself in that position where you knew that could happen.
Yeah.
And you have to be very careful. It doesn't mean don't go on social media because you're going to see some, Just use an example of some risque picture. I don't have social media. I've never had it, but that's my personality. And I understand that there are people that can use it for good. And so again, I think it's like
every person's different. And you need to know yourself.
You need to know yourself. Exactly. Yeah. So for myself, the reason I don't have social media is, I mean, frankly, it just doesn't appeal to me. I'm like, why am I going to, I'm going to go read books. I've always loved books. So for me, a distraction, or that would be like, someone mentions the news to me and I'll like the Iran thing and I'll go and
you might
start diving down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, you're like me that way. You might, next thing I know, I've spent 2 hours
on it. Right. And that's why I'm like, nope, we got to cut this off. Yeah. So that's like my pitfall. And so like you, so I think you just have to know yourself and know where in the scope of the thing you're dealing with, what images and words are you going to encounter such that there may be things that per se, but you're supposed to be there. So for example, if I'm reading scholarship, if I read Karl Marx, I mean, it's communism. That's not good. But I wouldn't go recommending reading everyone read Karl Marx unless it's relevant to their position, because it's a dark read. It's a lot.
But there has been good, reading about like World War II and anything really from the 20th century.
Right.
Gulag Archipelago,
Solzhenitsyn, yeah.
Yes. Yep, exactly. Or Viktor Frankl, like reading stuff from dark times so that you can understand it, and so that hopefully our culture never repeats it. There could be good from understanding the bad, but like what you were just saying is, I was going to use the example of exorcism for an example, as a common one that's often referred to as, you have to know yourself. And I know myself, being a researcher and a deep diver, that I don't do it. I just don't. Like, I don't watch the movie that talks even about a true story. It's not glamorized,
Yep.
Like, I was just recently saw some article pop up on a feed or something about there's a new upcoming movie about such and such exorcism that was, and it's supposed to be really realistic in that it, not supposed to sway, and this was supposed to be really interesting. I'm like, no, I'm not going into that one because I don't like scary movies either. But also because the same reason why I don't do a deep dive and start reading about it a lot. Because I know myself that, that's what the evil one wants, is that when you have that interest, it can then draw you in too deeply.
Yeah, there's a sin of curiosity.
Yes.
And so like, I think I'm with you on like the exorcism thing like that. Like, to me, how I spiritually evaluate it is like you, I'm like, I'll start researching and I'll get into it. But the other thing for me is I've determined, like, I'm obviously a very intellectual person, but like, there's only so much energy and time I have. I need to focus on the things intellectually that God wants me to focus on. Exorcism is outside of that scope. John of the Cross, ruthlessly cut that string, out it goes. Don't even think about it. Okay, what's the other thing I need to cut? What are other things I need to cut? Out, there it goes. And keeping and narrowing that focus towards what I think God wants me, in my case, to read. And you see what I'm getting at? And I think that as you refine that, then those things start to interrelate and the picture becomes clearer. And then it's easier to discern when the exorcism type thing shows up. You're like, wait a minute, that doesn't fit into this picture. Out it goes.
I think this kind of bookends pretty well from the beginning of our conversation here, when you're talking about just history with when you started diving deep into St. John of the Cross. We don't, again, the message, we don't have to all become Carmelites.
Correct.
We don't all have to do everything that he did.
Correct.
But the idea of minimalism, the idea of cutting the fat out.
Yep. Detachment. Yep.
Detachment theory is a good thing for all of us.
Yep.
It's just to what degree and what does it look like for each person.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
I think if the listener were to, from our long conversation here, what would you say a couple things that you'd really like someone to leave with from our conversation, or even just from your own, what you often talk about with the Carmelite and St. John of the Cross and that mysticism, that mentality, that way you live?
Sure. So just remember that we're all called to grow in the mystical life of seeing God. And what that means is seeing God in events, seeing God in yourself, seeing God in others. And when you just try at least to pray more so that you can start to grow, like we were talking about with the friend at the table, to see, you will start to see through faith, meaning faith will give you the ability to see that God is more present than you think, and that will cause you to love him more. And then, like John of the Cross says, that love will burn within you even when you're in that dark night, when things in your life are being taken away from you that you would prefer they weren't, or something, an injustice happens, or something just by chance happens that's poor.
Through half our life of like Job or something.
Right, exactly. I mean, even, Job had friends who basically accused him of robbing the poor and being a horrible person.
Yeah.
And it wasn't Job's fault. Job was God even pointed out, you're the righteous man.
But look how he got through it.
And look how he got through it, exactly. So just remember that in whatever suffering you're going through, that God is always present and he loves you and he wants that relationship with you. And however it manifests, he will follow, he will be there no matter what.
Yeah.
And nothing else matters but him. Nothing but God. Nada, nada, nada. He's the only thing that matters.
Nada, nada, nada.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll end this great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
And thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Catholic Passage podcast, and we hope that it blesses you. Please check out our show notes for a reflection takeaway, as well as more info on Catholic Passage. We aim to support parents and educators as they pass on the Catholic faith and way of life to their children and students. To find out more about what we offer, or how you might collaborate with us, visit CatholicPassage.com. Most importantly, you can support us through your prayers. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us.